You're a young woman in medieval England, and you've just discovered something that fills you with both terror and desperate hope. Your monthly bleeding has stopped. In the candlelit darkness of your family's cottage, you press trembling hands against your still flat belly, knowing that the life growing inside you could either be your salvation or your death sentence. Everything depends on one simple question that will determine your entire future. Are you married or not? If you're wed, this pregnancy transforms you into a vessel of honor, a keeper of bloodlines, a sacred incubator whose every breath is monitored by mothers-in-law, midwives, and community elders. But if you're unmarried, that same pregnancy brands you as a whore, a sinner, a creature so vile that your own family might stone you in the village square, while priests cheer from the sidelines. The exact same biological process, the exact same human life, but society's response depends entirely on a piece of parchment signed by men who will never experience the agony of childbirth themselves. Welcome to the hidden history of women's bodies, where for thousands of years every aspect of female biology has been legislated, regulated, and controlled by systems designed to serve everyone except the women themselves. You think you understand oppression because you've read about slavery, about conquered peoples, about economic exploitation. But there's another form of bondage that has existed in every civilization, every culture, every era of human history. It's the systematic control of half the human population through their own anatomy. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and resistance, if you enjoyed learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What I'm about to reveal isn't just another tale of historical injustice. It's the blueprint for how societies have always maintained power by controlling the most fundamental aspects of human existence. The rules weren't written in law books or carved into stone tablets. They were whispered between women, enforced through shame, and passed down through generations of mothers who had no choice but to teach their daughters how to survive in a world that viewed their bodies as public property. Picture yourself in ancient Athens, the supposed birthplace of democracy and rational thought. You're the daughter of a citizen, raised in the women's quarters of your father's house, never allowed to step foot in the agora where men debate philosophy and politics. Your entire education consists of learning to weave, to manage household slaves, and to prepare for the day when your father will hand you over to a husband he's chosen based on dowry negotiations and political alliances. But here's what the history books don't tell you about this enlightened civilization. Athenian law considered women so inferior that they couldn't own property, couldn't testify in court, and couldn't even leave their houses without male permission. Your body, your fertility, your very existence belonged first to your father, then to your husband, then to your son if you were lucky enough to produce one. If you died in childbirth, which happened to roughly 1 in 3 women, your husband would simply acquire another wife, often your own younger sister, to continue the cycle. The philosophers who wrote beautifully about justice and virtue saw nothing wrong with this system. Aristotle himself declared that women were naturally inferior to men, possessing less rational capacity and existing primarily for reproduction. These weren't the rantings of ignorant barbarians. These were the intellectual giants whose ideas still influence Western thought today, and they built their entire worldview on the assumption that women's bodies existed to serve male interests. Your daily reality in this democratic paradise involved being locked in the women's quarters during your fertile years, guarded by elderly female slaves whose job was to ensure your virginity remained intact until marriage. You couldn't choose your husband, couldn't refuse his sexual demands, and couldn't prevent him from divorcing you if you failed to produce male heirs. The same men who celebrated intellectual freedom and individual liberty never thought to extend those concepts to the women who bore their children and managed their households. But Athens was just the beginning. As we journey through different civilizations and different eras, you'll discover that the specific rules changed, but the underlying principle remained constant. Women's bodies were too important to be left under women's control. Medieval Europe added a religious dimension to this control that made resistance not just illegal, but literally damnable. The Christian Church, building on centuries of Greco-Roman philosophy, declared that women were inherently sinful, weak-willed, and dangerous. Eve's temptation of Adam became the justification for treating all women as potential sources of corruption, who needed constant supervision and guidance from virtuous men. Imagine you're a peasant woman in 14th century France. Your day begins before dawn, tending to animals, preparing food, and managing a household while your husband works in the fields. But your real value to society isn't your labor or your intelligence. It's your womb. The church teaches that your primary purpose is to bear children, preferably sons who can inherit land and carry on the family name. Every aspect of your reproductive life is scrutinized by the community, from the regularity of your monthly cycles to the frequency of your pregnancies. If you fail to conceive, you're blamed for the barrenness. The possibility that your husband might be infertile is rarely considered because that would challenge the assumption of male superiority. Instead, you're subjected to increasingly bizarre and painful treatments designed to open your womb and make you receptive to pregnancy. Hot irons are applied to your belly, herbs that cause violent purging are forced down your throat, and holy relics are pressed against your naked body while priests mutter incantations. When you do become pregnant, your body becomes community property in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Midwives examine you regularly, not just to monitor your health, but to verify that you're actually carrying your husband's child. Neighbors watch for signs of adultery or witchcraft. Church officials ensure you're following proper religious observances to guarantee a healthy birth. Your diet, your activities, even your thoughts are regulated because everyone believes they have a stake in the life growing inside you. The birth itself takes place in a room filled with women from the community, all of whom have opinions about proper laboring techniques and spiritual preparations. If you scream too loudly, you're accused of lacking faith. If you don't scream enough, you're suspected of using witchcraft to ease your pain. If the baby dies, you're blamed for some secret sin. If you die, it's considered God's will, but your husband quickly remarries to continue the cycle. But even these medieval restrictions pale in comparison to what awaited women in other parts of the world. In imperial China, the practice of foot binding literally crippled millions of women in the name of beauty and status. Starting when girls were as young as 4 years old, their feet were broken and bound so tightly that they never grew beyond 3 inches long. The resulting deformity made walking extremely painful and running impossible, ensuring that women remained confined to their homes and dependent on male relatives. The justification for this mutilation reveals the deeper logic of female body control. Tiny feet were considered beautiful because they demonstrated that a woman's family was wealthy enough to keep her from working. They also served as a guarantee of virginity, since women with bound feet couldn't travel far from home or engage in the kind of physical activities that might lead to sexual encounters. The pain was considered irrelevant because women's comfort was less important than male desires and social status. Chinese marriage customs reinforced this objectification through elaborate rituals that emphasized the transfer of women from one male-controlled household to another. Brides were literally purchased through dowry negotiations, examined for virginity by their future mothers-in-law, and expected to demonstrate their fertility as quickly as possible after marriage. A woman who failed to produce sons could be divorced or forced to accept concubines who might succeed where she had failed. The one-child policy implemented in modern China represents a contemporary version of the same basic principle. Women's reproductive choices subordinated to state interests. Millions of women were forced to undergo sterilizations, abortions, and other procedures against their will because their individual desires were considered less important than government population goals. The specific justifications changed, but the underlying assumption remained that women's bodies existed to serve larger social purposes rather than the women themselves. Islamic societies developed their own systems of female body control through practices like polygamy, temporary marriage, and strict segregation of the sexes. While Islamic law granted women certain rights that didn't exist in Christian Europe, it also institutionalized male authority over female bodies through detailed regulations about marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Women could own property, but their testimony was worth half that of a man's. They could initiate divorce, but only under very specific circumstances and often at great personal cost. The institution of the harem, romanticized in Western literature as a paradise of sensual pleasure, was actually a sophisticated system for controlling female sexuality and ensuring male paternity. Women were locked away from all contact with unrelated men, guarded by eunuchs, and subjected to constant surveillance to prevent any possibility of adultery. Their value depended entirely on their ability to produce male heirs for their master, and those who failed might find themselves replaced by newer, younger women. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of these historical systems is how they convinced women to participate in their own oppression. Mothers taught daughters to bind their feet, to accept arranged marriages, and to compete with other women for male approval. Older women enforced virginity requirements, supervised pregnancies, and punished those who violated sexual norms. The system worked precisely because it convinced half the population that their subjugation was natural, necessary, and even beneficial. This psychological control was achieved through a combination of religious indoctrination, economic dependency, and social isolation. Women were taught from birth that their value depended on their relationships to men and their ability to fulfill reproductive roles. Those who resisted faced not just legal punishment, but complete social ostracism, making survival nearly impossible in societies where women had few economic opportunities outside of marriage and motherhood. The witch trials that swept through Europe and colonial America represent perhaps the most extreme example of how societies used fear to control female bodies and sexuality. Thousands of women were tortured and executed on charges of using their bodies for evil purposes, consorting with demons, or disrupting natural order through their sexual behavior. The accusations often targeted women who were too independent, too knowledgeable about herbal medicine, or too willing to challenge male authority. These trials served multiple purposes beyond simple misogyny. They reinforced religious authority, eliminated potential rivals to male healers and midwives, and created a climate of terror that discouraged other women from stepping outside prescribed roles. The specific charges might seem absurd to modern minds, but they reflected deeper anxieties about female power and the need to maintain strict control over women's bodies and sexuality. As we prepare to delve deeper into these hidden histories, remember that we're not just talking about the distant past. The same basic impulses that led to foot binding, witch trials, and reproductive surveillance continue to shape policies and attitudes today. The methods have become more sophisticated, the justifications more scientific sounding, but the underlying assumption remains that women's bodies are too important to be left under women's control. In our next segment, we'll explore how these ancient patterns of control evolved and adapted as societies modernized, how the Industrial Revolution created new forms of reproductive surveillance, and how the rise of modern medicine gave authorities unprecedented power over female bodies. We'll discover that the struggle for bodily autonomy isn't just a feminist issue or a contemporary political debate. It's the continuation of a conflict that has shaped human civilization for millennia, determining not just individual lives but the rise and fall of entire societies. The story we're about to unfold reveals uncomfortable truths about power, control, and the price of progress. But it also illuminates the incredible courage of countless women who found ways to resist, to survive, and to pass down knowledge that authorities tried desperately to suppress. The Industrial Revolution promised liberation through progress, but for women, it delivered new forms of bondage wrapped in the language of scientific advancement. Picture yourself as a young factory worker in 1840s Manchester, England. You've escaped the suffocating confines of rural life, drawn by promises of independence and wages of your own. But what you discover is that industrial capitalism has simply mechanized the control of your body in ways your grandmother could never have imagined. The factory bell doesn't just regulate your working hours, it monitors your menstrual cycle. Supervisors keep detailed records of when each female worker bleeds, tracking patterns to predict productivity dips and absenteeism. Women who miss work during their monthly periods face wage deductions or dismissal, while those who work through the pain are celebrated as examples of proper feminine dedication. Your biology becomes a business liability that must be managed, measured, and minimized for maximum industrial efficiency. The dormitories where unmarried factory girls live operate like secular convents, with matrons who inspect your undergarments for evidence of sexual activity, and curfews designed to prevent unsupervised contact with men. Factory owners justify these restrictions as moral protection, but the real purpose is economic. Pregnant workers mean lost productivity, illegitimate children create financial burdens, and sexually active women might spread diseases that could shut down entire production lines. Your sexuality isn't just morally regulated, it's industrially managed. But the most insidious control comes through the new science of medicine, which gives authorities unprecedented power to pathologize normal female experiences. Doctors trained in European universities begin diagnosing women with hysteria, a catch-all condition that supposedly explains everything from political activism to sexual desire to simple disagreement with male authority. The cure involves treatments that would be recognized today as systematic sexual abuse, justified through medical terminology that makes torture sound therapeutic. Victorian physicians develop elaborate theories about female anatomy that bear no relationship to biological reality, but serve perfectly to justify social restrictions. They claim that women's brains and reproductive organs compete for the same energy, meaning education literally damages fertility. This pseudoscientific nonsense provides intellectual cover for excluding women from universities, professions, and political participation. Your ovaries become the explanation for your supposed intellectual inferiority, your menstrual cycle evidence of your natural instability. The marriage market adapts to industrial conditions by treating women's bodies like manufactured goods, subject to quality control and standardized specifications. Middle-class mothers obsess over their daughters' complexions, posture, and measurements, knowing that marriage prospects depend on meeting precise beauty standards. Corsets reshape torsos into fashionable silhouettes regardless of the damage to internal organs. Cosmetics contain lead, mercury, and arsenic that slowly poison users while creating the pale, delicate appearance that signals proper femininity. Medical examinations before marriage become routine among the wealthy, with doctors certifying brides' virginity and reproductive potential like livestock inspectors at a cattle market. These examinations often involve procedures that are indistinguishable from sexual assault, but the medical setting provides legal protection for what would otherwise be criminal behavior. Your most intimate anatomy becomes subject to professional evaluation by strangers who reduce your worth to the condition of your hymen and the capacity of your pelvis. The rise of photography adds new dimensions to body surveillance that previous generations couldn't imagine. Studios specializing in artistic nude photography emerge in major cities, ostensibly for aesthetic purposes, but actually creating a market for sexualized images of women's bodies. Police departments begin photographing prostitutes and other women deemed morally suspect, creating archives of female criminality that focus obsessively on physical characteristics, supposedly linked to deviant behavior. These photographic records serve multiple purposes beyond simple documentation. They create scientific-seeming evidence for theories about criminal types and moral degeneracy that target women who violate social expectations. A woman who leaves her husband, engages in political activity, or simply displays too much independence might find herself classified as a dangerous deviant whose photograph circulates among authorities as a warning to others. The colonial expansion of European powers exports these systems of female body control to every corner of the globe, often combining with existing patriarchal structures to create uniquely oppressive hybrid systems. British administrators in India work with local elites to codify Hindu and Muslim personal laws that restrict women's property rights and reproductive choices. French colonizers in West Africa collaborate with traditional chiefs to enforce customs like female genital mutilation, while claiming to bring civilization to backward peoples. Missionary activities provide religious justification for destroying indigenous practices that gave women relative autonomy while imposing Christian marriage customs that reduce wives to legal property. Native American women who had traditionally controlled agriculture, property, and even warfare find themselves confined to domestic roles and stripped of political influence. African women's traditional roles as traders and healers are criminalized as witchcraft or immorality, forcing them into economic dependence on male relatives. The abolition of slavery in the Americas creates new challenges for controlling women's bodies, as societies grapple with questions of citizenship and human rights. Former enslaved women face particular vulnerabilities as they navigate freedom without legal protections or economic resources. White authorities develop new systems of racial control that specifically target black women's sexuality and reproduction, using medical experimentation, forced sterilization, and criminal prosecution to maintain white supremacy through the regulation of black bodies. Reproductive control becomes a tool of genocide as governments implement policies designed to prevent certain populations from reproducing, while encouraging others to increase their birth rates. Native American women are sterilized without consent in government hospitals. Jewish women in Eastern Europe face pogroms that specifically target pregnant women and mothers. The language of public health and social improvement masks programs of systematic elimination that operate through the control of female reproduction. The eugenics movement that emerges in the early 20th century represents the scientific culmination of centuries of female body control, using the authority of medical expertise to justify unprecedented interventions in women's reproductive choices. Forced sterilizations target women deemed unfit for motherhood, based on criteria that include poverty, mental illness, criminality, and racial identity. State institutions become laboratories for experimentation on women's bodies, with procedures performed without consent and often without the knowledge of the subjects themselves. These programs receive support from leading universities, medical associations, and political figures who present forced sterilization as progressive reform that will improve society by preventing the birth of defective children. The victims are typically poor women, immigrants, racial minorities, and those with disabilities who lack political power to resist. Their bodies become sites of scientific intervention, designed to engineer a better future that explicitly excludes people like them. World War I transforms women's relationship to body control by creating labor shortages that force societies to reconsider restrictions on female employment and mobility. Women enter factories, offices, and even military service in unprecedented numbers, gaining economic independence that threatens traditional systems of patriarchal control. But this temporary liberation comes with new forms of surveillance, as authorities monitor women workers for signs of political radicalism, sexual immorality, or other behaviors that might disrupt social order. The war also normalizes medical intervention in civilian bodies as governments implement public health measures that give authorities new powers over individual autonomy. Venereal disease control programs target women as sources of infection, while largely ignoring male customers who spread disease through prostitution. Women suspected of carrying sexually transmitted infections face forced medical examinations, quarantine, and treatment that often causes more harm than the original condition. Post-war reconstruction brings both opportunities and new restrictions, as societies attempt to return to traditional gender roles while acknowledging women's contributions to the war effort. The ideology of Republican motherhood emerges in many countries, celebrating women's political importance as mothers of future citizens, while restricting their direct participation in politics. This creates a paradox where women's bodies are simultaneously elevated as sacred vessels of national renewal and controlled as too important to be left to individual choice. The Russian Revolution promises to liberate women from centuries of oppression, and early Soviet policies do eliminate many legal restrictions on female autonomy. Divorce becomes easily obtainable, abortion is legalized, and women enter the workforce in massive numbers. But this liberation proves temporary as Stalin's regime implements new forms of reproductive control designed to serve state interests rather than individual desires. Soviet women find themselves caught between competing demands for their bodies, as the state simultaneously needs their labor and their reproductive capacity. Policies shift dramatically based on economic needs and political calculations, with women's rights expanding or contracting depending on whether the government prioritizes industrial production or population growth. The promise of socialist liberation becomes another form of state control over female bodies, dressed in the language of equality and progress. The interwar period sees the rise of fascist movements that make the control of women's bodies central to their political programs. Nazi Germany implements policies that categorize women based on racial criteria and reproductive value, rewarding mothers of Aryan children while sterilizing or murdering those deemed genetically unfit. The state becomes the ultimate authority over reproductive decisions, with individual preferences subordinated to racial ideology and national goals. These fascist programs represent the logical endpoint of centuries of female body control, using modern technology and bureaucratic efficiency to implement systematic policies of reproductive coercion. The specific ideologies vary between countries, but the underlying principle remains constant. Women's bodies belong to the state rather than to the women themselves, and individual autonomy must be sacrificed for larger political objectives. As we stand on the threshold of examining how these historical patterns continue into our modern era, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The systems of control we've explored weren't aberrations or products of ignorance. They were sophisticated, intentional programs designed by intelligent people who believed they were improving society. The fact that these programs caused immense suffering to millions of women was considered an acceptable cost for achieving larger goals. The transition from historical to contemporary forms of body control doesn't represent a clean break with the past, but rather an evolution of the same basic impulses using new technologies and justifications. The language changes from religious to medical to scientific, but the underlying assumption persists that women's bodies are too important to be left under women's control. Understanding this history isn't just an academic exercise in documenting past injustices, it's essential preparation for recognizing how these same patterns continue to shape contemporary debates about reproductive rights, medical autonomy, and bodily freedom. The specific technologies and justifications evolve, but the fundamental conflict remains. Who has the right to make decisions about women's bodies, and whose interests should those decisions serve? The 20th century promised to liberate women from centuries of oppression, but what emerged instead was a sophisticated system of control disguised as progress. Picture yourself as a young woman in 1950s America, the supposed land of freedom and opportunity. You've been told you're living in the most advanced civilization in human history, where democracy and individual rights reign supreme. But your daily reality tells a different story entirely. Your doctor prescribes tranquilizers for the anxiety you feel about your restricted life, pathologizing your natural response to suffocating circumstances. When you express dissatisfaction with domestic isolation, you're diagnosed with a mental disorder rather than acknowledged as a rational person responding to irrational limitations. The medical establishment has created an entire category of female mental illness that conveniently explains away women's resistance to their assigned roles. The contraceptive pill, hailed as a revolutionary advancement in reproductive freedom, arrives with strings attached that reveal the persistence of patriarchal control. You can access birth control, but only if you're married and have your husband's permission. Single women are denied contraceptives because their sexuality is still considered illegitimate and dangerous. The same technology that could liberate women from unwanted pregnancy becomes another tool for enforcing social conformity and punishing those who violate sexual norms. Hospitals become new sites of reproductive surveillance where your body is treated as public property the moment you become pregnant. Labor and delivery procedures prioritize medical convenience over maternal comfort or choice, with women routinely sedated into unconsciousness during birth and awakening to find their babies already delivered by male doctors who made all decisions without consultation. The natural process of childbirth is transformed into a medical emergency requiring professional intervention, stripping women of agency during one of their most profound life experiences. The rise of consumer culture creates new forms of body control through advertising that promises happiness through physical transformation. Magazines filled with impossible beauty standards convince women that their natural bodies are inadequate and require constant modification through products, procedures, and lifestyle changes. The fashion industry collaborates with medical professionals to promote weight loss methods that damage health while claiming to improve it, creating generations of women who see their bodies as enemies to be conquered rather than homes to be cherished. Psychiatric hospitals become warehouses for women who refuse to conform to social expectations, with electroshock therapy and lobotomies used to eliminate inconvenient personalities and desires. Women who are too intelligent, too sexual, too independent, or too angry find themselves diagnosed with conditions that require radical intervention to restore proper feminine behavior. The language of mental health treatment masks systematic campaigns to eliminate female autonomy and resistance. The sexual revolution of the 1960s appears to offer liberation from centuries of repressive attitudes about female sexuality, but it quickly reveals itself as another form of male control dressed in progressive language. Women are told they should be sexually available without emotional attachment, satisfying male desires while suppressing their own needs for intimacy and commitment. The pill removes pregnancy fears, but it also removes women's traditional power to demand marriage and fidelity from sexual partners. Pornography emerges as a mainstream industry that shapes sexual expectations and reduces women to collections of body parts designed for male consumption. Young women grow up believing that their value depends on their willingness to perform acts they see in pornographic films, regardless of their own comfort or pleasure. Sexual liberation becomes sexual exploitation as women's bodies are commodified and their desires subordinated to market demands. The women's liberation movement fights back against these systems of control, demanding equal access to education, employment, and political participation. But even feminist victories carry unexpected consequences as societies adapt their methods of control to accommodate changing circumstances. Women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers, but they're still expected to manage households and childcare while maintaining perfect appearances and pleasant dispositions. Liberation becomes exhaustion as women assume all the responsibilities of men while retaining all the burdens of traditional femininity. The legalization of abortion represents a significant victory for reproductive autonomy, but it also triggers new forms of surveillance and control as governments implement waiting periods, mandatory counseling, and parental consent requirements that treat women as incapable of making their own medical decisions. Clinic protesters harass women seeking reproductive health care, photographing their faces and publishing their personal information to shame them into compliance with religious expectations. The right to choose becomes a gauntlet of humiliation and intimidation that many women cannot navigate successfully. Medical advances in reproductive technology create unprecedented opportunities for controlling female fertility through in vitro fertilization, genetic testing, and selective pregnancy termination. These technologies promise to eliminate genetic diseases and improve human health, but they also enable new forms of discrimination against women based on the genetic characteristics of their eggs and embryos. Women's bodies become laboratories for genetic experimentation as society pursues the elimination of undesirable traits through reproductive intervention. The rise of cosmetic surgery transforms body modification from medical necessity to consumer choice, creating industries built on convincing women that their natural anatomy requires correction. Breast augmentation, liposuction, and facial reconstruction become routine procedures that promise to improve women's lives through physical transformation. The medicalization of beauty standards gives surgical intervention the authority of healthcare while serving purely aesthetic goals that benefit everyone except the women undergoing dangerous procedures. Eating disorders emerge as epidemic conditions affecting millions of women who internalize impossible standards about body size and shape. Anorexia and bulimia become expressions of the same control impulses that have always targeted women's bodies, internalized and self-administered through food restriction and purging behaviors. Women literally starve themselves in pursuit of social acceptance, demonstrating how external control becomes psychological compulsion that operates without obvious coercion. The digital revolution creates new forms of surveillance and control that previous generations could never have imagined. Social media platforms encourage women to document their bodies constantly, seeking validation through likes, comments, and shares that reduce self-worth to quantifiable metrics. Dating apps transform romantic relationships into markets where women's bodies are evaluated and ranked according to standardized criteria that prioritize youth and conventional attractiveness over personality or compatibility. Reproductive tracking apps promise to help women understand their cycles and plan pregnancies, but they also create databases of intimate information that can be accessed by employers, insurers, and government agencies. Your menstrual cycle, sexual activity, and fertility status become data points in corporate algorithms that influence everything from job opportunities to insurance rates. The quantified self movement turns bodily autonomy into voluntary surveillance as women participate in their own monitoring and control. The medical industrial complex develops new forms of pathologizing normal female experiences through diagnoses like premenstrual dysphoric disorder and postpartum depression that treat natural hormonal fluctuations as mental illnesses requiring pharmaceutical intervention. Women are prescribed mood-altering drugs for conditions that were once considered normal variations in female experience, creating lifelong dependencies on medications that suppress natural emotional responses to biological and social circumstances. Contemporary debates about transgender rights reveal how deeply embedded assumptions about biological sex continue to shape social policies and individual opportunities. While supporting gender identity recognition, these discussions also demonstrate how societies still organize themselves around biological categories that restrict individual freedom and self-determination. The body you're born with continues to determine access to spaces, opportunities, and protections regardless of your personal identity or individual circumstances. Global economic systems exploit women's bodies through international surrogacy arrangements that allow wealthy couples to purchase pregnancy services from poor women in developing countries. These contracts reduce pregnancy to commercial transactions while claiming to provide economic opportunities for disadvantaged women. The language of choice and empowerment mask relationships that closely resemble historical forms of reproductive exploitation, updated for contemporary global capitalism. Human trafficking networks specifically target young women and girls for sexual exploitation, creating modern slavery systems that operate through the same basic principles that have always governed female body control. Victims are isolated from support systems, convinced that their value depends entirely on their sexual availability, and subjected to violence that ensures compliance with demands they never consented to fulfill. The international scope and technological sophistication of these operations demonstrate how traditional forms of exploitation adapt to contemporary conditions. The rise of authoritarian governments around the world brings renewed attacks on reproductive rights as political leaders use control over women's bodies to signal their commitment to traditional values and religious authority. Laws restricting contraception access, criminalizing abortion, and limiting women's healthcare return to legal codes in countries that had previously recognized reproductive autonomy. The justifications change, but the underlying impulse to control female sexuality and reproduction remains constant across different political systems. Climate change and environmental degradation create new forms of reproductive control as governments implement population policies designed to address resource scarcity and ecological collapse. Women in affected regions face pressure to limit childbearing while being denied access to education and economic opportunities that would enable them to make informed reproductive choices. Environmental crisis becomes justification for renewed control over female fertility, with individual desires subordinated to collective survival needs. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates how quickly societies can implement unprecedented restrictions on bodily autonomy when circumstances seem to justify emergency measures. Mask mandates, vaccination requirements, and quarantine policies reveal how easily individual choice can be overridden by claims of public health necessity. While these measures serve legitimate medical purposes, they also establish precedents for government control over personal medical decisions that could easily extend to reproductive health care and other aspects of bodily autonomy. Social media influencer culture creates new pressures for women to monetize their bodies through platforms that reward sexual content while maintaining plausible deniability about exploitation. Young women are encouraged to build personal brands based on their physical appearance and sexual availability, creating economic incentives for self-objectification that operate through market mechanisms rather than direct coercion. The entrepreneurial language of personal empowerment masks relationships that closely resemble traditional forms of sexual exploitation. As we prepare to examine the contemporary landscape of body control in its full complexity, we must acknowledge that the patterns we've traced through history haven't disappeared. They've simply evolved to match current technologies, economic systems, and cultural values. The specific methods change, but the underlying assumption persists that women's bodies are too important to be left entirely under women's control. The digital age has created surveillance capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction to previous generations, while biotechnology offers intervention possibilities that raise fundamental questions about human identity and autonomy. The next phase of our journey will explore how these emerging technologies interact with ancient impulses to control female bodies, creating new forms of oppression disguised as progress and liberation. Understanding this history isn't just about documenting past injustices or satisfying intellectual curiosity about how societies have organized themselves around gender differences. It's about recognizing patterns that continue to shape contemporary debates and individual experiences, preparing us to identify and resist new forms of control before they become so normalized that they become invisible. The story we're uncovering reveals that the struggle for bodily autonomy isn't a recent development or a fringe political issue. It's the continuation of humanity's oldest conflict about power, freedom, and the right to make decisions about one's own body and life. Today, as you swipe through social media feeds filled with filtered faces and surgically enhanced bodies, you're witnessing the culmination of thousands of years of female body control, now packaged as personal choice and individual empowerment. The algorithms that determine which images you see have been trained on centuries of male desire, amplifying certain body types while rendering others invisible. Your phone screen becomes a mirror reflecting not your own beauty, but society's continuing obsession with controlling how women should look, act, and exist. The fitness industry promises liberation through physical strength, encouraging women to build muscles and develop athletic capabilities that previous generations were told would damage their fertility and femininity. But even this apparent progress comes with hidden restrictions. Women are celebrated for being strong as long as they remain conventionally attractive, flexible enough to accommodate male preferences, and careful never to appear more powerful than the men around them. The gym becomes another stage for performing acceptable femininity rather than a space for genuine physical empowerment. Modern medical practices continue the tradition of treating women's bodies as problems requiring professional intervention. Routine procedures like pelvic exams are performed without adequate pain management, based on outdated assumptions that women's discomfort is less important than medical convenience. Young girls receive HPV vaccines while being denied comprehensive sex education, creating a system where their bodies are protected from disease but their minds are kept ignorant about how those bodies actually function. The beauty industry has evolved into a multi-billion-dollar complex that profits from convincing women their natural state is inadequate. Cosmetic procedures once reserved for wealthy elites are now marketed to teenagers through social media campaigns that present surgical modification as routine self-care. Lip fillers, breast implants, and Brazilian butt lifts become rites of passage for young women who grow up believing their bodies are construction projects rather than homes for their souls. Reproductive healthcare remains a battlefield where women's medical needs are subordinated to political ideologies and religious beliefs. Doctors refuse to perform sterilization procedures on young women without husbands' consent, assuming that all women must eventually want children, regardless of their own stated preferences. Insurance companies cover erectile dysfunction medications while limiting access to contraceptives, revealing whose sexual satisfaction society considers important and whose reproductive choices deserve support. The normalization of hormonal birth control represents one of the most successful examples of medicalizing women's natural cycles while presenting intervention as liberation. Millions of women suppress their monthly rhythms with synthetic hormones that carry serious health risks, often starting in their teens and continuing for decades. The side effects, depression, blood clots, decreased libido, are dismissed as acceptable trade-offs for the convenience of preventing pregnancy, as if women's mental and physical health are less important than their reproductive control. Dating culture in the digital age has created new forms of sexual commodification that operate through apps designed like shopping platforms. Women create profiles that reduce their complex personalities to carefully curated photographs and brief descriptions, competing for male attention in markets that reward youth, conventional beauty, and sexual availability. The language of choice and empowerment masks systems that function exactly like historical marriage markets, just with faster transactions and less legal protection. Workplace discrimination has adapted to legal requirements for gender equality by developing subtle forms of bias that are harder to identify and challenge. Women are penalized for pregnancy, childbearing, and even the possibility of future motherhood through hiring practices that never explicitly mention reproductive status. The glass ceiling persists through informal networks and cultural assumptions that present themselves as natural consequences of biological differences rather than systematic exclusion. The rise of wellness culture has created new ways to pathologize women's natural experiences while selling expensive solutions to problems that don't actually exist. Hormone balancing, detox cleanses, and supplement regimens promise to optimize female biology according to standards that have nothing to do with actual health and everything to do with generating profits from women's insecurities about their body's natural functions. Social media influencers promote dangerous practices like extreme dieting, unregulated supplements, and DIY medical procedures to audiences of impressionable young women who mistake marketing for medical advice. The democratization of health information has created chaos where anyone can present themselves as an expert while selling products that exploit women's desire to feel better in bodies that society has taught them to see as inherently flawed. Reproductive surveillance has entered a new phase with fertility tracking apps that claim to empower women with knowledge about their cycles while actually collecting intimate data that can be sold to advertisers, shared with employers, or subpoenaed by government agencies. Your most private biological information becomes a commodity in databases that insurance companies can access to adjust your rates, or employers can use to avoid hiring women of childbearing age. The medicalization of menopause transforms a natural life transition into a disease requiring pharmaceutical intervention, convincing women that their aging bodies are medical emergencies rather than examples of normal human development. Hormone replacement therapy is marketed as anti-aging treatment that promises to maintain youth and sexual availability indefinitely, as if women's value expires when their reproductive years end. International surrogacy markets exploit economic desperation in developing countries, allowing wealthy couples to purchase pregnancy services from women who lack other economic opportunities. These arrangements are presented as mutually beneficial business transactions, but they operate through the same power dynamics that have always enabled the exploitation of poor women by wealthy elites. The global nature of these markets makes regulation nearly impossible while maximizing profits for intermediary companies. The normalization of casual sexual encounters through hookup culture appears to offer women sexual freedom, but it actually creates new forms of coercion where women are expected to be sexually available without emotional investment or commitment. The removal of traditional protections like courtship and marriage leaves women vulnerable to exploitation, while being told they should celebrate their liberation from outdated restrictions. Pornography consumption has become so normalized that its influence on sexual expectations goes largely unexamined, even as it shapes how entire generations understand sexuality, consent, and intimacy. Young women grow up believing they should perform acts they see in pornographic content regardless of their own desires or comfort levels, internalizing male fantasies as expressions of their own empowerment. The gig economy has created new forms of body commodification through platforms that allow women to monetize their appearance, personality, and sexuality while maintaining the fiction that they're independent entrepreneurs. OnlyFans, cam sites, and sugar daddy apps present sex work as empowering business opportunities while extracting significant portions of earnings and providing no labor protections or healthcare benefits. Eating disorder treatment focuses on restoring normal eating patterns while rarely addressing the cultural messages that created the disorders in the first place. Women are taught to have healthier relationships with food while remaining immersed in environments that constantly reinforce impossible beauty standards and equate thinness with moral virtue. The rise of gender-neutral language in some contexts coexists with increasingly rigid beauty standards that affect women regardless of how they identify. The pressure to modify bodies through surgery, hormones, and other interventions has intensified even as society claims to be more accepting of diverse expressions of gender and sexuality. Mental health treatment for women often focuses on helping them adapt to oppressive circumstances rather than addressing the social conditions that create psychological distress. Therapy becomes a tool for increasing women's tolerance for inequality rather than a space for developing strategies to challenge and change harmful systems. The climate crisis is being used to justify new forms of reproductive control, as governments and organizations promote smaller families as environmental responsibility, while failing to address the consumption patterns of wealthy individuals and corporations that actually drive ecological destruction. Women's fertility becomes a target for environmental activism, while male-dominated industries continue polluting with impunity. As we reach the end of our journey through history's hidden patterns of control, we must confront a sobering reality. Despite centuries of struggle and apparent progress, the fundamental assumption that women's bodies exist to serve interests other than their own remains largely intact. The methods have become more sophisticated, the justifications more scientifically complex, and the coercion more subtle. But the underlying dynamic persists across cultures, political systems, and historical periods. What makes this continuation possible is the very invisibility of these systems to those who benefit from them. Men who would never explicitly endorse female subjugation participate in economic, medical, and social structures that maintain it. Women who consider themselves liberated internalize restrictions so completely that they experience them as personal choices rather than external impositions. The path forward requires more than legal reforms or policy changes, though those remain important. It demands a fundamental shift in how societies understand the relationship between individual autonomy and collective interests, between personal choice and social responsibility. It requires recognizing that true freedom cannot exist when half the population lives under systematic constraints that the other half neither experiences nor acknowledges. The women who came before us, those who died in childbirth because they had no choice about pregnancy, who were tortured for expressing sexuality, who were locked away for displaying intelligence, deserve more than our sympathy. They deserve our commitment to ensuring that their suffering was not meaningless, that each generation builds on their resistance rather than simply repeating their oppression in new forms. Your body is not public property. Your reproductive choices are not community decisions. Your sexuality is not a moral statement about your character. Your appearance is not a reflection of your worth. These truths seem obvious, but they represent revolutionary ideas that challenge thousands of years of human organization around the control of female bodies. The next time someone tells you how women should look, what they should want, or how they should behave, remember that you're hearing echoes of voices that have sought to control women across every civilization and every era. The specifics change, but the song remains the same. Your power lies in recognizing these patterns, refusing to internalize them, and insisting on your right to make decisions about your own body and life. The future remains unwritten, shaped by choices we make today about whether to accept inherited systems of control or to imagine new possibilities for human freedom and dignity. The wombs, chains, and silence of history need not define tomorrow, but only if we're willing to see clearly what came before and choose consciously what comes next.